Welcome back to DemystifySci. I'm Shiloh.
I'm Anastasia.
This is the podcast where we explore theories that we think may have a decent chance of changing the way we see the world in the future. And the way this all got started for me personally was with a little book I found in the library when I was probably 11 years old. And I was just trying to get to the bottom of the questions my parents and teachers couldn't answer, like, what the heck is gravity? Where did the universe come from? What is going on? And I went through all the popular science books, and they just constantly bewildered me. These impossible multidimensional realities and strings that were one-dimensional folding up into the universe, and Big Bang emerging. The universe emerging from this Big Bang singularity. But one book stuck out to me, and it was our guest today's book, Eric Lerner, who wrote the seminal thesis arguing against the Big Bang called The Big Bang Never Happened. So Eric is absolutely formative for me in this whole process that led up to what we're doing today, which is looking at alternatives to standard narratives, because that's the way the world seems to unfold. People have a really good idea of how something works, and it slowly crumbles until some better understanding yields a more fruitful solution. So this is a really incredible conversation today for me to be having on the podcast after all these years. I've interacted with Eric a bit back when we were in New York. Nasty and I brought him together to do some guest lectures for this physics series that we were putting on. And this is the first time we've actually gotten to sit down and have a dialogue about his ideas on the future of cosmology. But what's even more exciting is Eric is going to come and join us at our conference in person this summer in Sesimbra, Portugal, where we are bringing together all sorts of perspectives on what comes next in cosmology, because it seems like something is definitely crumbling at the core of the standard story that we've been telling for maybe the last 70, 100 years in cosmology of what is going on in the sky. What are the stars telling us about the history and evolution of the structures? Where do galaxies come from? Where do stars come from? It's a very different story that's emerging from the one that we've been telling in recent decades.
I think it's going to be a really extraordinary event because we're bringing together all of these different people. We're celebrating the 5-year anniversary of DemystifySci, and we're mapping a chart for the future of astrophysics and cosmology because the Academy is not going to do it. Somebody has to, and we figured that it might be us. And so a huge thank you to Eric Lerner for coming, and a huge thank you to all the other guests from Gareth Samuel of See the Pattern, Alexander Unzicker, C.S. Krishnan, Martin Lopez Corredora, Patrick Van Reyes, Mike McCullough, Indranil Banik. We have such an incredible slate of people. It's going to be a fantastic weekend. There's still slots available. We're selling memberships this year instead of tickets because we're using it to fund the whole project. And so we've sold out all of our stakeholder members. Those come with a room at the conference hotel and all your meals and everything else. And so at this point, we're selling memberships that come with, you can come to the conference, come to all the talks, come to the meals. You just can't get a room through us. You have to arrange all of your lodging yourself. But we have a limited number of even those available. So I would strongly encourage you to get your travel plans in order and to plan to come to Portugal this summer. We would absolutely love to see you.
And remember, this entire project, from the podcast to the conferences, it's entirely supported by you guys. That means we work directly for you. But we do need your support in return, which means you should come over and check out our main source of funding, which is patreon.com/demystifysci. If you do join up, it can cost you as little as 75 cents a week. I mean, think about that for a second. 75 cents a week, it's almost nothing. But the reality of the situation is that hundreds of 75 cents a week add up to the situation where Anastasia and I can spend almost all of our time dedicated towards this project of bringing new perspectives to the table. So please come on over, check it out. www. Nobody ever says that anymore these days, but I just did. www.patreon.com/demystifysci and see how you can get involved.
We meet with all of our patrons once a week, which is actually one of, I think, the best places on the internet because we're trying to figure out what it looks like to have these large conversations with differing viewpoints. Everybody's thought really deeply about the topics, and it's just this really awesome space. New people come and they kind of hang out for a couple times, get a feel for the situation, slowly slide to start into the conversation, and we're gradually forming this like very cool discussion space that I think doesn't exist anywhere else.
Last thing I want to remind you guys about is our new segment, Paradigm Drift. If you have a theory that you've been tinkering with over the years and you would like to try it out on us and our esteemed panel, we are putting on this segment where you get to present that idea. At least you get to put your name in a hat to be drawn out with the potential of presenting your idea. So check it out. There's a link to that in the description, and I would love to see you at the next Paradigm Drift, which is on May 9th. That's going to be at 6:30 Eastern. So enjoy this conversation with Eric Lerner. It's not only an exposition of Eric Lerner's ideas about cosmology, but also a beautiful historic analysis of the struggle between plasma cosmologies and gravitational cosmologies. I think you guys are going to love it. So tell me what you think in the comments, and I'll see you next time.
The scientific revolution starts now.
The DemystifySci podcast.
Let us see in the dark.
Your book has this incredible opening chapter where you lay out what I take to be a story of the way that metaphysics shift. Where sometimes you have this culture that says, no, things are comprehensible, things can be mechanistic, things can be understood, and then it swings where you have a different culture which says, no, actually it's very weird and mysterious and beyond comprehension, and the stories that we tell that are built on those assumptions are very different. And so maybe for people that haven't read the book, you could start with that idea of the pendulum swing from eternity to a beginning and back and forth.
Right.
That's gone through history.
So the idea of a cosmological pendulum or a scientific pendulum was an idea that was introduced to me by Hannes Alfvén. So Hannes Alfvén, I think, is probably the leading physicist of the second half of the 20th century. He's pretty much the founding father of modern plasma physics, which is the physics we use to understand most of the universe and that we are using to develop fusion energy here on Earth. So Alfvén's concept that he had developed by thinking about this problem of the development of the Big Bang mathematical theory was that over history, there have been huge swings between an essentially authority-based idea of how we get knowledge. We get knowledge from the Bible, from the priesthood, and the science-based approach, where we get knowledge by observing the universe, by observing the world around us, making hypotheses and testing those hypotheses by things that happen in the future. So, in brief, science gives us a way of partially knowing the future. That's its usefulness to us, and that's why science has allowed humanity to grow from a very small population to the billions of people we have on the planet today. And what he was particularly pointing to is that the big swing that you learned about in your, elementary history books, the scientific revolution, the overthrow of the Ptolemaic Earth-centered universe, the development of science, that big swing in the 20th century had started to partially swing back to mythology, to a mathematical mythology, and that's what's indicated in the Big Bang. And what I developed in my book, which again was not original, was based on the ideas of the historian C. Gordon Childe, was that these swings were not happening in a vacuum, but corresponded to the development or de-development, collapse of society. That societies that were hierarchical, in which there was slow development or even de-development, a dark age, those corresponded to the periods where knowledge was coming from authority, and that the periods in which society was developing rapidly, was moving forward, those were the periods where you had the development of the scientific method. So what is the scientific method? So we were just discussing the idea of epistemology. So epistemology, nice Greek term, means your theory of how knowledge is acquired. How do we determine what is true in the universe, what is true in society? And the scientific method is a method that humans have been using a lot longer than there's been anybody called scientists. It's the method in which we make observations that give us ideas, hypotheses about what is true. And then we test those hypotheses by making predictions about the future and seeing whether those predictions are right. If those predictions are right, then we accept that our hypothesis is true. So, to give my favorite example, when our ancestors were hunter-gatherers and there was the medicine man, and the medicine man would be explaining to his successor or assistant, you see this mushroom, you see how it's curled here and here and here. If you gather a basket full of these mushrooms, you can make a delicious soup. It's very nutritious. See this mushroom with little red markings here? You eat even a whole mushroom, you'll go to meet our ancestors very quickly. And I know that because I took a really, really tiny piece, which is what I do. And when I ate it, I got really, really sick. I almost died. So that individual was making a hypothesis, based on observations. Was I okay after eating this mushroom or not okay? He made a hypothesis that it was this characteristic of the mushroom, a wavy rim or something that identified a specific species that could predict whether you thrived or died by eating this particular mushroom. And obviously, the tribes that had the medicine men who had this, basic primitive notion of scientific method, they were the tribes that survived and thrived. And those are our ancestors. The ones that said, the spirit has told me all red mushrooms are good. Those weren't our ancestors because they all died off. So, in a very real sense, I don't have the exact quote, but Marx more or less said, the test of truth is human survival, is our own existence. If we do something for long enough that doesn't correspond to truth, we cease to exist. Now, that may not be true in the short run, but in the long run, that's true. In the long run, the more humanity as a whole uses the scientific method, the more of us there are and the better our lives are. When we lose that, then things start to go wrong.
I think that's one point that Ayn Rand and Karl Marx would actually agree on.
All right. I'll leave that to you.
I mean, I think that something that you said there, which is that in the short run, it's hard to tell, especially when we live in a really technologically sufficient environment. We have lots of food. Like the other day, we were talking about scarcity, and I looked up how much food is produced in the world per person. And there's enough food to feed every single person on Earth with 3,000 calories a day. And so the technological juggernaut that has ensured our survival, I think leads people to the mindset that everything's kind of okay and that the authorities have it figured out because everything works. And we're constantly running up against this question of, well, what does it matter if we're wrong about something like the Big Bang? Like the idea of the Big Bang as being or the birth of the universe as being a scientific endeavor rather than a mythological one is in and of itself kind of a modern construct. And then, so you have this modern construct of the birth of the universe, and then on top of that, you have the fact that, well, it's scientific, but it doesn't really have a huge bearing on people's existence. It doesn't seem directly related to whether or not you're going to starve tomorrow. And so this is kind of a big question, but why does it matter if the universe had a beginning or it didn't have a beginning? And
Well, but this disconnect you're talking about is a product of the present historical moment. If we turn the clock back to the end of the 19th century, which was a period of extremely rapid technological progress. I mean, if you imagine somebody being born in 1870, living a normal life, and dying at the end of World War II in 1945, 75 years later, think of how different the world seems to this individual from his earliest memories. Earliest memories would be, horse-drawn carriages, gaslighting, or kerosene, or even whale oil. Of course, there was, machines in the factories, but many aspects of human life had changed little since, centuries ago. He dies in a world where, most people in the United States, let's say he was an American, have automobiles. Horse-drawn carriages obviously no longer exist. We have telephones, radio, beginnings of television, uh, passenger airplanes, and most dramatically, obviously, if he witnessed the atomic bombings that ended the war, the unleash of atomic energy. So enormous, rapid progress and a very enormous increase in the standard of living as measured by a very rapid decline in the death rate, big extension in life expectancy. So if you go back to that time, ordinary people, were taught by the mass media, by everything, that technological advance was key to the advance of human beings, key to their standards of living. In the 19th century, in many parts of this country, in England, one of the popular forms of entertainment was scientific lectures. Imagine that compared with today's entertainment. People would go to these lectures and leading scientists, going back to the beginning of the 19th century in England, this started, would explain cutting edge concepts in ways that they hoped, everybody could understand. And they expected that the basics, not the mathematics of it, the basics could be understood. And it was necessary that the basics could be understood because the capitalists who ran society then as now knew that they needed skilled workers who could understand electromagnetism because they had to build and maintain the completely new electrical technology that was starting to run society, and that by the middle of the 20th century was completely dominating society. So the idea back then that scientific knowledge led to technological progress. And although I won't say this was explicit, implicit, the proof of the validity of scientific knowledge was the development of technology that was based on. Again, people weren't talking about epistemology, but I don't think there's been a period in the history of humanity where many people talked about how do we know what we know. But the cycle was known. The development of science leads to technology. The development of technology leads to a higher standard of living. And the development of technology, scientists explained, gives us new instruments, new ways of looking at the universe. So technology leads back to new scientific discoveries. So to give a simple example, improvements in vacuum technology, which I know from chasing leaks is really tough, but getting better vacuum allowed the development of the Crookes tube, in which there was enough vacuum, there was low enough pressure in a sealed glass tube that electrons could move through that tube. So that led to the discovery of X-rays, which X-rays were applied medically within weeks of the scientific discovery of this. The discovery of the electron, something 1,000 times less massive, 2,000 times less massive than the atom, the discovery of radioactivity, and pretty soon the discovery of the existence of nuclear energy. So all of these things were happening very fast. So the question that you raise in today's society, no, it really wasn't a question. It was taken for granted that science led to technology, technology led to better standards of living. What you have today is after the post-war boom, which was, again, a period of rapid technological development, not as rapid as this earlier period, but almost as rapid, very rapid increase in the standard of living. I mean, the rate of decline in the death rate peaked at the end of the 1960s. So the 60s really were the good old days. So after that point, starting in the early 1970s, the oil crisis of 74 is a kind of good turning point. You have an extremely rapid change, negative change in the rate of technological development. The underlying cause was that the post-war boom ended at the point where capitalism could no longer easily develop the world's productive resources at a profit. Now, this wasn't a final ending because the incorporation of the East Bloc, Soviet Union and China, into the capitalist system, starting in the late 90s, and especially after the turn of the century with the integration of China into the World Trade Organization. This sort of gave them breathing room, and there was a little boost, especially in the developing world in the first decade of the 20th century. But this slowing of technological development started to break the ideological common sense idea that our survival was based on technology. And this directly fed into and was accelerated by the ideological notions in cosmology. Because you look at the timeline of the development of Big Bang cosmology, and up until the 1960s, the early 60s, First of all, almost nobody was discussing cosmology. It was really a very, very tiny field in science, dozens of people. And second of all, it was pretty open. The Big Bang concept had been proposed in the 1920s by Abbe Georges Lemaitre. Not many people accepted it. And it had gone through a popularization after World War II in the 1950s by George Gamow, who was a nuclear scientist who had worked on the Manhattan Project. And he drew the analogy, which was very ideologically, propagandistically effective, between an atomic explosion and the Big Bang. So he developed this theory that just like all these radioactive elements existed and were discovered in Nevada after the first Trinity test, all the elements that were made of were created by the Big Bang. Well, scientifically, this turned out to be totally invalid. But propagandistically, it was very valid, especially because George Gamow was a terrific, one of our leading science popularizers. He was a great writer. In my evolution of physics study group that we're having, I actually use one of Gamow's books about the development of quantum mechanics. It's just excellent. It makes everything really clear and historically valid.
What's
So
that book called?
What?
What's Gamma's book called?
30 Years That Shook Physics, I think it's called. So as a child, I remember reading Gamow's books, 1, 2, 3 Infinity, and all right, I forget the name of the other one. But they were very entertaining, and he certainly made the Big Bang very plausible. And little kids, especially little boys, love explosions. I mean, what's better than that? But it was still, it wasn't gospel. And it only started to become gospel in the 1960s, where capitalism was reaching this crisis and really becoming unarguable in the 1970s, when there was this sudden transition from rapid growth of the world economy to basically stagnation. And in this country, in the United States, it actually was a transition to a declining standard of living. I mean, when you look back, it's shocking the actual increase in the hours of work. Remember, hours of work had been rapidly decreasing up until World War II. After World War II, they stabilized at the 40-hour week. And then in the 1970s, they began to creep upwards. You had more women in the workforce, which was positive, but there was no compensation in the family work week. So the family work week was steadily rising, putting, raising a family under great stress because there was less and less time for that. You had decline in medical services. Again, this is shocking to read these statistics, but in 1970, there were twice as many doctors and twice as many hospital beds per capita in the United States as they are today, 50 years later. Inverse progress, obviously, deterioration. So as this situation developed, and it was so dramatic, people became aware of it during the 70s, that things were no longer progressing, especially in the United States. Then it sort of gradually spread outward to the other industrialized countries, and eventually to, in the lost decade of the 80s, to the developing world. So simultaneous with the slowing in real progress was a dissipation of the idea that science is validated by technology. I mean, think about it. In all of these years, again, person born in 1970 is in their mid-50s now. What is the major technological developments they've seen? It's the development of the World Wide Web and the smartphones. That's basically it. So, yeah, communications have taken another big step forward, but everything else is exactly the same. We fly the same airplanes. Transportation has not evolved. The source of energy has not evolved. In 1966, oil surpassed coal as the principal energy source. Coal had been the principal energy source for only 60 years, from 1910 to 1966, supplanting wood. And yet here we are, 50 years, no, more than 60 years later. 60 years later, oil is still dominant, and there's no transition really rapidly to either solar or wind, nuclear, or anything. So all of these basic technologies have stagnated. And, along with that, production of food, yes, if it was well distributed, we would have enough food for all. But in fact, it's not. And many, many people in the world, shamefully, are malnourished. Some of them are starving, many of them in Gaza. So that's what starts to break this ideological link. So to bring it to the present, obviously, we understand, we plasma physicists, that there is an enormous link between cosmology and energy, because we learn about plasmas primarily by studying the universe, which is 99% composed of plasma. That's electrically conducting gases. And we use that knowledge, especially we at LPP Fusion, to advance fusion energy, which could completely transform technology by providing unlimited, extremely cheap, clean, safe energy to replace oil and gas. So the link between cosmology and technology really exists, but at the moment it's ideologically buried by the dominant viewpoint.
Interesting. So you almost see the state of cosmology as symptomatic of a larger swing that's based in the stagnation of technological progress. It's sort of a ramification of that pendulum swinging back in the other direction, where people have come to not expect science to provide us with new technological solutions. So they're more willing to entertain quasi-mystical ideas.
Exactly, right. So, cosmology was sort of the canary in the mine shaft, because it was easiest to separate that from technological development. It was sort of self-feeding. Once the Big Bang notion became dominant, part of the Big Bang is that the only really important force in the universe is gravitation. Gravitation is a force that is scale dependent. On the scale of you and me, you and I are in the same room, we are gravitating to each other. But the electromagnetic forces, right, this ball is being attracted to the Earth by the entire mass of the Earth. And yet, with a single finger, I can overcome this attraction of the whole Earth, even though my finger is really tiny, because I'm using electromagnetic forces. Electromagnetic forces are actually what's driving my muscles. So on this scale, gravity, while it's not negligible, we can never forget gravity if we want to live a long life, it's much smaller force than electromagnetic forces. As we go to larger and larger scales, electromagnetic forces remain basically constant in magnitude while gravity grows bigger and bigger. So on the cosmic scales, yes, gravity becomes pretty much co-equal in importance with electromagnetism. So it becomes more plausible, their idea of let's ignore electromagnetic forces. But it's wrong. And by ignoring electromagnetic forces, they say, well, this is about gravity, especially about general relativity. These forces are much less important on the scale of technology. So that break between cosmology and technology started, between technology and science started with cosmology back in the 70s. And we started to have this, what Alfvén termed mathematical myth. Mathematical myth is not a new form of myth. The geocentric universe, the Ptolemaic universe, had a lot of complicated math in it. I mean, I challenge any of people watching this to figure out an epicycle. Well, Ptolemy figured out these epicycles, and everybody who did it figured them out. But it wasn't science. It was a mathematical myth saying that we take on authority that the Earth is the center of the universe. We take on authority that the circles are perfect, so things in the sky are perfect. And then we fit that mathematical model to observations we've already made. So that's where it started. But as the decades passed, the disconnect became more and more until we see, outrageously in 2025, the core of medical science is being thrown away. And we have decisions at the government level being based on mythology. No, we don't have to study how to prepare for the next pandemic, which may be around the corner. We have Robert Kennedy as a source of authority saying, take ivermectin or take cod liver oil. So we're going back to a purely mythological basis and destroying by totally defunding medical science, which was sort of the last science to start to be separated from technology.
There's like a weird set of incentive structures that are at the heart of science, whether it's medicine or Big Bang cosmology or particle physics, where there's a lot of people that are making money hand over fist for a given paradigm. Like the pandemic was the biggest bottom line for every single pharmaceutical company that was involved in, I think, the history of pharmaceutical companies. I think that CERN is maybe one of the biggest scientific undertakings. The Big Bang projects of these massive telescope arrays are just guzzling funds. And so I feel like there's this weird interplay where, we talk a little bit about the way that science was working at the end of the 19th century. And as I read it, I'm like, yeah, there's characters that are at universities and they're professors, but we're still at this point where there's a lot of hobbyists, a lot of people that are working on things that are outside of this massive industrial funding regime. And so it seems like there's progress that's happening in part because the systems have not yet been captured by a single significant economic interest. And so something that I kind of wanted to come back to, which is tangential to this, is why the Big Bang prevents plasma from being such an important part of the cosmos. Because as you said, you look out into the cosmos, everything is plasma. how does that get sidelined to be something that's incidental, like accidental? Like, we're obsessed with dark matter and dark energy, which is supposed to be, 99% of the universe.
96.
96? Oh, I'm sorry. But that seems weird to me because, okay, so there's this thing that's undetectable, invisible. We've constructed entire research programs around it and insisting that it's very, very important. And yet plasma, which is obvious and ever present, seems to be kind of this, it's like the butt of the joke almost. It's very weird.
All right, but you're raising two distinct questions.
Yeah.
One is the sociological, and the other is the scientific/ideological. I mean, obviously, during the course of the 20th century, the structure of scientific research changed radically. But you can't exaggerate science was very much institutionalized at the end of the 19th century. First of all, you did have, the development of companies that were entirely science-based. The big example would be Edison. So Edison pretty much invented the notion of a industrial research lab, which he headed and was the chief scientist in the Edison lab here in New Jersey. So that became one model of industrial enterprise, actually in-housing, as we would say, scientific applied research. And the universities had developed, at that time, self-funded research. And obviously, the amounts of money that were needed were far less than today. I'll get into how far less, but you really didn't have to spend a lot of money to build a Crookes tube. And all these, huge revolution in science that occurred starting in 1895 were based on this simple piece of technology. But already, some experiments needed more funding. Sort of the founder of, or the precursor of plasma physics, Christian Birkeland, he was studying the aurora, and he was, of course, aware of the simultaneous research with the Crookes tube. So his theory was, just like the Crookes tube showed that these particles, they didn't know that they were electrons, were causing this glow. He thought the aurora was caused by a glow in the space with charged particles coming from the sun. So to demonstrate that in the lab, he built a Torella. And a Torella is basically sort of a primitive electrical model of the Earth surrounded by plasma. So it was in an enclosed vacuum chamber. Those experiments started to exceed what the university wanted to spend. And then he said, to test some of his predictions observationally, he had to go to the north of Norway into the Arctic region to actually measure electrical currents coming from the aurora. And those expeditions cost a lot of money. So even then, he decided that he needed to raise the money himself. And he actually became a businessman, an entrepreneur, to finance these experiments. So you were having the transition where experiments were getting too expensive to just finance out of your own pocket. for very limited university funds.
I know
So
that
that
this is going to
shift
be.
was happening.
I know that this is a detour, but can you tell about the experiments that he was doing there? Like, what was he like flying airplanes to measure things? Was he like building antennas or just measuring
No,
quantum
no,
conductivity?
what he was doing was he made the hypothesis that was very important to all subsequent work, that based on Maxwell's laws, that sufficiently strong electric currents had to be traveling along magnetic field lines. So a magnetic field line is an imaginary concept, but it traces something real, which is it connects the direction of the magnetic field at each point. So if the direction of the magnetic field is similar as you move in space, you get that's the direction of the magnetic field line. So it's a mapping of something very real, magnetic field. And the magnetic field, as I'm fond of saying, is the real force that pervades the universe, not the Star Wars one. But there is a single magnetic field pervading everywhere in the universe, stronger or weaker. So if you have a electric current that is not aligned with the magnetic field, then the electrons, what we know to carry the current, orbit around this magnetic field line. This just comes from Maxwell's laws. And two things happen. One is the orbiting electron radiates energy, so it slows down, and it can't travel in one direction. It has to travel in a helix. If it travels, and if there's any resistance over great distances, it loses energy to collisions. If it travels along the magnetic field line, it can move straight in that direction, and the energy loss is minimized and the current is maximized. So, knowing this, Birkeland hypothesized that there should be field-aligned currents that go straight down to the Earth from the aurora. So they would only reach the Earth in the Arctic areas. So he went there with magnetometers, which measure the magnetic field. And to make somewhat long story, somewhat shorter, what he found was that the pattern of magnetic fields went in circles. So these were placed in mountains during winter storms at great risk to their lives. It's amazing they all survived. But what they showed was that the field was in a circle. And again, from Maxwell's laws, if there's a circular field, there has to be a current moving through it. So basically, he showed that there were these vertical currents that had to be aligned with the center of these magnetic field arrays.
And
So all of this
are
costs
these
money.
Birkeland currents?
These are the Birkeland, what are now called the Birkeland currents, because he discovered them.
And Birkeland currents are helical or they're just circular?
Well, we get into something where you really should show an image of this because my hands aren't going to work.
I can write it
But,
down, yeah.
We can edit that in later. No problem.
right. But basically, a Birkeland and subsequent researchers, including Alfvén, showed that there's such a thing as a force-free filament. That's a basic structure that nature forms at all scales. And a force-free filament is that at the outside of this filament, the currents are moving helically, and the magnetic field is exactly the same, helical. like a tight screw. At the center, if you have a helical current, at the center of that current, called a solenoid, you have a magnetic field that runs straight along the axis. So the current and the field at the center runs straight along the axis. In between, it's intermediate. You get a tighter and tighter helix as you go from the center of this filament to the outside. So all of these things, the currents combine so as to produce the magnetic fields, and the magnetic fields guide the currents. So we've explained this in one of our videos. We can post the link. So that's the easiest, the minimum energy loss way of getting current from one place to the other. So that's because Mother Nature is not lazy, but she doesn't want to work hard. That's the way that currents move in the universe and here on Earth.
And before we get back to the story of, the cost of experiments rising and the fact that Birkeland had to fund himself, was this transformative for the paradigm of how we understood the universe when he discovered it? Was it, or did people kind of already know that there must have been some kind of current
No, this was
impinging on the Earth?
this was a big discovery, and it would have. So this was again at the same time as discovery of the electron, X-rays, radioactivity, radioactive materials, nuclear energy, relativity. All of these discoveries were going on at the turn of the 20th century, from the 19th century. To a certain extent, because of his location in Scandinavia and in Norway, not in the major centers, his work was lesser known. It would have become much greater known. He was being considered for the Nobel Prize. Scandinavians were aware of his work. And the problem was he died. And you can't be awarded a Nobel Prize posthumously. And because he was, no longer active, a lot of this knowledge was not incorporated into the main trend of the revolutionary developments in physics. So plasma physics, almost from the start, started to become isolated from the rest of physics. Very briefly, it is a funny story. He realized that his theories led to the idea of electromagnetic acceleration of a projectile. So he thought, aha, military applications. And even back then, military applications got better funding. So he set up a joint stock company to fund the development of an electromagnetic gun. Now, he found that the velocities weren't fast enough for artillery, so he said this would be used to launch torpedoes. So he set up a big fundraising event with a live demonstration.
Oh, no.
Something that we never do. And he set up this demonstration and he said, you'll see nothing, you'll hear nothing, but the target will be destroyed. So they were all sitting right next to this machine, and there was a short. So he got a tremendous arc. These arcs are very loud. We have tiny loud arcs that sound very loud. There was a huge burst of light. And as he put it, in an instant, I shot my stock price from 300 kroner to 0. So everybody was, they didn't want anything to do with it. But he, as a scientist, viewed this arc, and he knew I may be pronouncing this wrong, Eddy, who was working on the chemical problem of artificial nitrogen fertilizer. So people were running out of bat guano, which was the source of nitrogen fertilizer. And he needed a tremendous spark. And Birkeland said, I have a tremendous spark. I can deliberately do what I did accidentally. So together, they developed the process that to this day produces the tons of nitrogen fertilizer that have vastly increased food production around the world. And this is still a big industry in Norway. So he used that to fund his expeditions. So you were already having the transition that you needed corporate funding, your own in an industrial research lab, or funneled through the universities. Now, this became much more centralized after World War II, in which, the defense establishment in the United States and elsewhere looked at the atomic bomb, this transformative weapon, and said, oh my God, we have to take control of research. Scientific research is the way to control the world. So you had this tremendous centralization of scientific research funded by the federal government, fed through both universities directly, as we now see when this process is being reversed under Trump, and through the big research labs of the industries, both self-funded and funded by government, Bell Labs, IBM Labs, and so on. So, of course, as you had more and more centralization of funding, to a certain extent, you had the potential for the development of orthodoxies. But what was fighting that was two things. One was industry and government really wanted technological products out of this. They wanted things that worked. And two was, as the post-war boom developed, the economy was rapidly developing. There was enough money for research, but there wasn't much competition. You got what you needed. In physics, all you had to do was say, the Soviet Union is developing this new welder. Do you want us to be behind in the welding race? No, here, have $100 million. And that's how it went. So when you don't have the threat of being cut off from research, and we still haven't had the threat of the unorthodox being burned at the stake, then orthodoxy wasn't such a big thing. When you had the reversal, when you had the slowing of economic growth starting in the 70s, and especially when you had the contraction of funding for science after the end of the Cold War, when in the United States funding for physics was rapidly cut by 40 to 50%, then in areas that were highly centralized, you started to get sharp competition for funding. And if you have those two ingredients, centralization of funding and inadequate funding, then orthodoxy is almost a natural product.
It's
Right.
like consolidation.
It's easier to get funding if you're doing something that everybody knows is right. In cosmology, that went much more quickly. Again, it was the canary in the mine shaft because cosmology was not funded by industry, who thought that was far, far too down the line for any real effects. And the government funding was, in most countries, just two committees. In the United States, it was a committee in NASA and a committee in NSF, the National Science Foundation. And of course, these committees were dominated by theorists who had made their careers developing the Big Bang. So they weren't going to fund things that destroyed their careers. So what I'm saying is, by contrast, for example, even though there were orthodoxies in medical science, the fact that medical science the funding was still preserved up until the present year because it was the seed money for the pharmaceutical companies. The government would pay for the universities to do the basic research, and then the pharmaceutical companies would come along and say, "Thank you very much. We'll carry on from here," and they would make tremendous profits.
This is a funny story that has almost no relation to the question of plasma cosmology, but I think it's an interesting industrial reflection. Shiloh the other day pulled up this article that was talking about how there was some kind of dopaminergic drug that was being prescribed for restless leg syndrome that was inducing people to have massively risky behavior. Like they would develop like super promiscuous sexual behavior, they would develop gambling addictions. They would like the same way that for Parkinson's drugs for a while it was.
What was the name of the drug?
I don't remember the name of the drug,
Yeah.
but it was being prescribed for restless leg syndrome. And Shiloh and I were cracking up because at the same time, the like sports betting industry was flourishing. And I was like, what an unholy marriage of industry and capitalism. You're prescribing this drug for a condition which is just, go outside and walk around more, and it's just ending up
Drink
with
less coffee.
Yeah, it's ending up with people with debilitating gambling addictions.
So, of course, to summarize, the dual trends of slowing technological progress. So big companies like IBM, AT&T ended up either shuttering or selling off their giant research labs or focusing them on essentially non-scientific pursuits like software. Software is part of developing technology, but it's obviously not based on, it's a craft, a perfectly useful craft, but it's not based on the need for new scientific knowledge.
It's certainly not based on physics.
Right. And, so I actually, before I was full-time in physics, I was a science writer. And I was employed as a freelancer writing about the research at IBM, Thomas J. Watson, which was their principal, still is their principal research facility in New York. And I could see by what they were asking me to write about this very rapid evolution in the course of the 90s, because some of my first articles were actually astrophysics. There was a researcher who was studying the development of galaxies. So this was
at IBM?
At IBM. Pure basic research that they were funding because they did feel that, basic research would someday lead to applied research. So as the years went by, as I say, this was pretty rapid during the 80s and 90s. First, they stopped the basic research. And then fewer and fewer of the applied research, the development of new semiconductors, new semiconductor technology, didn't die off entirely, but it became less and less. And more of the articles were strictly about software development. So I could see this go over a very rapid period. And so obviously, all of these tend to break the idea that we learn, that as we learn basic science, we apply it to applied technology, and then we can apply that applied technology both to improving life and to developing new scientific instruments. But I do want to, at some point, get to why we're talking about Big Bang as a myth and not science.
Yeah, let's get there. I definitely want to make sure that we understand the evolution of plasma cosmology across the 20th century first. But one quick question: was the IBM research related to the galaxy filament simulations that are in your book?
No. I'm trying to remember the exact research I had written about. Yeah, I think I do. This was a pair of scientists, Bruce Elmer. I forget. Yeah, I'm sorry. I forget his wife's name, but you should look it up.
It was a couple.
Yeah, they were a couple of astrophysicists. So the basic question is, and this is a problem that is throughout conventional cosmology, if you ignore electromagnetism, you don't get results from gravity that correspond to observation. So the key question is, you look at galaxies like our own. It's easier to look at other galaxies because we're not inside them. And they're these beautiful pinwheels. They're these spiral disks, with the disk being much thinner, 10 times thinner than it is across. And people realized very early on, I don't know whether this was at the start of computer simulation, that gravity would never form absolutely never form disks with these spirals for two reasons. One is, if you somehow impose the spirals, gravity would never create the spirals. If you somehow impose the spirals at a certain time in your simulations, gravity destroys them. It wipes them out because in order to maintain a spiral, the velocity has to increase linearly with distance from the center. But as Kepler pointed out centuries ago, and has never changed since, with gravitation, the velocity increases as the square root of the distance. So if you have a mass, then Newton's formula is G, universal gravitational constant, times mass equals v squared r. So as r decreases around the same mass, like the sun or the center of our galaxy, v will decrease as the square root. So that means that the outer edges of this spiral will fall further and further behind. And as the astrophysicists say, it's the winding up problem. Spiral will look more and more and more, will have more and more winds, and then it will completely get erased. Same thing with the disk. The disk, while a stable configuration in the short term, it starts to get wobbles. And eventually it becomes a fat disk, not a thin disk. So Almagreens were studying this observationally. They were studying velocity, how velocity varied. I'm not sure how much they were getting into the question of what's the solution. So this was one of the early justifications for dark matter. If you say dark matter does not interact with itself, it's just like fairy dust. You can describe it as any way you want. Fairy dust is green, it's blue, it's invisible and blue. If it doesn't interact with itself, it won't settle into even approximately a disk. It will be a sphere. And if we arbitrarily make the sphere more massive than the disk, we can stabilize the disk. You still can't stabilize the spiral, but at least you've got the disk. So anyway, the point is, back then, this was still of interest to IBM.
I mean, I love recasting this in the lens of, profit margins. And as everybody's profit margins get progressively narrower and narrower and narrower, they're forced to cut things that are exploratory or tangential to the main research program. And I think that it's a useful lens for being able to understand the way that everything kind of comes apart
But
because it's just this thing running in the background.
it's also the question of your planning horizon, right?
Mm.
When capitalism was developing rapidly, capitalists assumed that they would be giving, their shares to their children, to their grandchildren. They had to plan for reasonably long terms. I don't think it was ever longer than a generation. But the idea was, and science was developing rapidly, was, even though it was always, especially after World War II, put on government and universities to fund basic research, the general idea was you had to fund things that would become profitable 20 or 30 years down the road. Otherwise, you'll get jumped.
And
Somebody
now you
else will
need
be doing
something,
that.
and now you need just the next quarter. Like you've
Right.
basically
So now,
transitioned.
exactly. Now, what happened was you see the planning horizon gets smaller and smaller. So you throw out basic research because who cares what's happening 20 years from now? Then you start to throw out applied research because the market isn't not growing anymore.
Mm.
If the market's growing, you need new technologies to get a bigger share of that future, bigger market. If it starts to shrink, then it's a question of what do we do to get a bigger share of this market? Cut wages, cut research. We're not going to need research because the market's getting smaller.
Mm.
And, again, what you see in the past couple of months is the extreme outcome. I mean, what is what I call not Doge, but DOPE, the department, the do our plunder efficiently. So what they're doing is they're getting rid of anything that competes with the need to direct as much income in the present quarter, in the present year, back to the very wealthy. I mean, again, Trump has made this really naked when he says, well, if we cut the budget, if we cut this, that, and the other thing, then, and if we raise tariffs as a new source of income, as a regressive tax, then we have all the money that we need to fund the next round of tax cuts for the rich. So that's
And also the military. I think we're talking about a $1 trillion military budget in the next
right. Of course, that's
year.
always expanding. But, that's at the government level. But you see the same phenomena at the corporate level.
Mm.
Is that if you look at the balance in the economy, you see industries aimed at redividing the market growing and industries aimed at supplying the market shrinking. Because, what does manufacturing do? It produces goods that people need. What does advertising do? It divvies up the market among those who are producing. And the biggest companies now, social media companies are advertising companies. They are among the biggest ones. So, so, so you get to the situation where, capitalism doesn't need research because it doesn't have a future. They're just planning for the present.
Dear listener, pardon the interruption, but I have to ask you for a favor. If you are listening to this conversation and you are just entranced by the ideas, touched by the fact that something like this exists, then I have to ask you to come over to patreon.com/DemystifySci and support the project. I am absolutely positive that the most important thing that we can do is we can provide this forum without being sponsored by Athletic Greens or Coca-Cola or Pfizer or anybody else. We're not going to sell you weird mattresses. We're not going to sell you grounding bracelets. We want to exist solely by virtue of the fact that we are producing something that is extraordinarily valuable to the world and to you. So if you value what we produce, come over to patreon.com/DemystifySci, where you can support the project for 75 cents a week. It's not a whole lot, but it changes the world for us.
Yeah, I wanted to see if we could catch up in the story of plasma cosmology between Birkeland and Alfvén, because we had a really fascinating conversation the other day with another presenter who's going to be at our conference in Portugal this summer, Gareth Samuel, who's a fantastic science communicator, and he's studied the story of plasma cosmology a bunch, and he pointed out some really interesting things that happened after Alfvén, and I wanted to compare his ideas with yours. But we need to get up to Alfvén first.
And so I think that to get to Alfvén, it would be cool to tell a linear story. So we have Birkeland, who travels to the Arctic. He finds that there are these places where the currents are driving directly into the Earth. And that seems to transform our knowledge of how the Earth works. And so I wonder if we can start from the point where he makes this discovery, talk about how that shifts our scientific understanding, and then how Alfvén emerges from this.
Okay. But when are we going to get the chance to talk about why the Big Bang actually is scientifically invalid? The evidence.
That's what we'll wind down on.
Yes.
I think we need to tell the story of the alternative to the Big Bang first.
Okay, we're going to be linear. All right. Chronological, that's fine. I do things chronologically a lot. So, as I said, it was very unfortunate that Birkeland fell ill and died when he was still in his 50s. Definitely that put a kink in the development of the field. So what happened next was the question of aurora, which was the actual phenomenon that he was dealing with. That became taken over by another scientist, a British scientist by the name of Sidney Chapman. And already back here in the 1920s, so I forget Birkeland's actually death date, but it was, I think, in the teens, probably before World War I. So Chapman was was an example of the early development of the purely mathematical approach to science. Now, what had happened at the time of World War I? We already have the development of special relativity, the early stages of the development of quantum mechanics. Scientists are still grappling with trying to understand the structure of the atom. And we have the first stage of cosmology becoming a popular topic, and that is the announcement of the discovery of the bending of light by the sun after the 1919 solar eclipse expedition, which was broadcast around the world by the mass media as a vindication of Einstein's theory of general relativity. And this was immediately after World War I, point where nobody outside of science had ever heard of Albert Einstein. And although he was certainly well known within physics. And while the mass media had always covered astronomy as something that people are fascinated with, this was really the first time it became headline news. And if you look at the New York Times coverage of this, it was the lead story, right-hand story. Didn't have a banner headline, but it was the right-hand story on their front page. So it was all about space is bent, gravity is curvature, light has mass. It was played up as the first of what I would call a wow, gee whiz approaches to cosmology. That it was realized from the start that the incomprehensibility of this was, a good news lead, something that would create readers, excite readers, and so on. At the same time, it was an enormous step backwards because what was emphasized was that this was entirely the product of Einstein's mathematical genius, that he was working with these four-dimensional equations, which Einstein himself said were difficult to, deal with and keep in mind. And from this pure, mathematical description, this new theory of the universe was unveiled and was confirmed by just a single experiment, a single observation. So this was a big step in, first of all, creating the myth of the theoretical physicist as some sort of priest. He spoke an incomprehensible language, with equations on the board. He said things that either seemed to be nonsense or were extremely difficult to understand. And, of course, this was described as a discovery in pure research, something that had no real technological, but only ideological viewpoint. And it's unfortunate that this certainly was mainly the creation of the mass media. This is how they described it. But we can't absolve Einstein himself. To a certain extent, he did feed into it in a very ambiguous way. In some of his writings, and he wrote a lot for the popular writings, What is Relativity is a popularization. He actually reinforced that, saying explicitly that science is going to move from inductive, from observation-based, to purely deductive, to creating theories based on just mathematical consistency, basically the way the universe just had to be. And although he emphasized it was a joke, his, soundbite in which he was asked, what would have you done if the observation did not confirm your theory? And he said, I would feel sorry for the dear Lord. The theory is right. He meant it as a joke, but there was the kernel that this is the way he had calculated that this is how the universe must be. So observations must conform to it. Now, if you read other of his writings, he explicitly contradicts this. He says, this is pretty much an exact quote, all science must derive from observation. So you had these two sides to Einstein himself, but the net effect of him and the mythologizing of him and his approach to general relativity recreated very suddenly, overnight, this alternative viewpoint, which had been totally discredited by the scientific revolution, starting back with Galileo hundreds of years before, because this was the attitude of Ptolemy, that by pure reason, we can derive what the universe must be like, and we use observations to simply tweak the theory, as people would say, to correct the theory, to create the epicycles, so as to ex post facto draw the theory back into accord with observations that have already been made. So basically, this is a model that inverts the scientific method. Instead of predicting something that will happen in the future and then testing the theory against those predictions, you assume the theory and then make it fit observations that have already been occurred, which is a fundamental difference. As I'm fond of saying, it's like the difference between riding an airline in which the airline says, we guarantee that in 99.99% of our flights, you'll get across the Atlantic safely. And an airline that says, well, our last 13 flights have all crashed, but we knew after the fact why it was that they crashed, and we corrected that error. So which airline would you fly? The scientific method airline gets you across the Atlantic, or the Ptolemaic method airline, which explains the crashes after they've occurred. You can read about it in your obit. So this incident enormously revalidates the older pre-scientific mathematical method.
Hey,
So,
really quick, a quick aside
yeah.
with that. How much do you think that we can attribute this to the mass movement away from church orchestrating society? Like, it seems like a mathematical shaman or the priest class of mathematicians rising up in the 20s might in some way be directly tied to the loss of popularity of the church institutions as like this organizing principle in people's lives. It's almost like a power vacuum for the spiritual mysticism that perhaps the church used to carry the banner of. But now people go looking for that, and inevitably they turn to the scientists, and the scientists are happy to do it because why not?
Well,
It's a fun job, I guess.
no, I think it was much broader than that. I mean, in my book, I quote one of Einstein's biographers, Dr. Pais, and he gives a sort of good sociological. I mean, this is immediately after the World War and the pointlessness of the World War and its tremendous loss of life and destruction had very much demoralized wide sections of the society because it had totally discredited all of the existing institutions without really, for most people, creating something in its place. Obviously, for socialists, communists, the extreme left, the model of the future was the Russian Revolution, which had occurred 2 years previously. But for many people, there was no certainty. Authority had been destroyed, all authorities, secular and religious. You also had, of course, at this actually still occurring in 1919, the flu epidemic, further destabilizing everybody. So what Pais said was, yeah, Einstein, this notion that the mass media pretty much created, the idea of a priest who you could trust but not really understand, that became a very appealing notion and was part of, the resonance of the Einstein phenomena.
It seems like the mass media must have been tapping into some zeitgeist, though. Like, they knew that that was going to be a banger headline. Like, they knew people wanted that really badly. They wanted, they love that. Like, people love black holes. My students, like, I can,
Right, but
they love dark matter. They love dark energy. And you can explain to them alternatives that are much more physical and mundane. But at the end of the day, they still want to know, like, what's it feel like in a black hole,
Right,
you know?
right. This what was Pace had a very good phrase for it. The idea of simultaneously being explained something and being told you can't understand it. The appeal of mysteries. And, the Catholic Church knew about the appeal of mysteries. Oh, how can God be one and three at the same time, his own son? This is a mystery. Yeah, it has
The
an
original
appeal.
wave-particle duality.
But, the newspapers, even though, it is part of the modern epoch, the beginning of the 20th century, and the newspapers had immediate feedback. They could see that, they had the street sales as the immediate feedback that they could read the next morning in their sales. I mean, of course, they did have subscription. Most of their sales were streets. So this was a story that was selling. And you can see, and I point out in my book, how the story evolved. Because the first reaction to this quote, which did not originate with Einstein, but with another scientist, that only 12 people in the world could understand general relativity. The initial editorial reaction at the Times, so they were writing editorials about this, was this seems pretty unfair. This is such a big thing and only 12 people can understand it. Can somebody explain it to the rest of us? So that was their initial reaction. But within days, it came that they were celebrating this mystery, that, this is something that can only be known to a tiny number of people, that can only be understood. So the point was this development of the theoretical physicist, the mathematical physicist, as a priesthood, that was felt as a shockwave within physics very rapidly. Because up until that time, it isn't that there wasn't a tension. We see in the 19th century people like Maxwell who, completely united theory and experiment. I mean, Maxwell's great insight that electromagnetism was a description of light came from his understanding that recent measurements of what was the speed of light corresponded to a constant in the electromagnetic equations. So, but fast forward even a decade, he started being involved with, can we use the analogy, the mathematical analogy, which is very real, between electromagnetism and fluids, motion of fluids, hydrodynamics, which had been developing mathematically in the late 19th century, to get a mathematical model of atoms, a vortex model of atoms. So this idea that we can write the equations that describe everything was emerging even from, the giants of the 19th century who themselves, tied their equations quite tightly to observations. But with this Einstein phenomenon, you get a flourishing. And obviously, yeah, who doesn't want to be, I won't say who doesn't want to be, but a lot of people quite enjoy the idea of being an intellectual priesthood, right? You don't
And
get
it's
the middle
something
of,
for the masses to aspire to as well, right? So, there's only 12 people who understand this. Perhaps I too can wrap my head around it and then become part of this vaunted class of the
I
few who
suppose,
know.
but it was more the thrill of trying to understand something that was really a mystery.
Mm.
What you talked about, today, why are black holes sexy, which they still are. I'll get to that in a second, but But, well, in a minute, because we're going. So,
So basically, we have this kind of nascent plasma cosmology that gets derailed by people's passions for relativity. Is that kind of the model?
no, what I'm saying is it created the atmosphere that a person like Sidney Chapman could tap into.
Mm.
So without the Einstein phenomena, you probably wouldn't have gotten Chapman to take over this field of aurora. So what happened? So he's working in the 20s, starting in the 20s, very soon after this 1919 revolution. And he ignores Birkeland's work, just flat out ignores it. And he says, the aurora must show, he took one thing from Birkeland, that the aurora were caused by currents hitting the atmosphere. So it was some sort of fluorescence. But he said, instead of saying, what do the laboratory experiments tell us about what should be happening, which is Birkeland's approach, he said, what is a clean, elegant way to model this mathematically? And the way he chose was to model all of the currents occurring in a spherical shell, because you had the development quite a bit earlier of the mathematics of spherical oscillations. So spherical moments, very elegant mathematics that had been developed. So based on no observations, he said, let's fit these currents into these elegant mathematical theories. And he got an elegant theory of the aurora that were strictly confined to the outer atmosphere of the Earth. And basically saying there was nothing between the Earth and the sun. It was a perfect vacuum, no Birkeland currents or anything. So that's what Alfvén came into. Now, Alfvén is a Swedish scientist who becomes interested in plasma physics as applied to the cosmos. And he is aware of both Birkeland's work and the pioneering plasma physicist of the 1920s, who was Lev Landau in the Soviet Union, and Langmuir even earlier. So Langmuir was the first to name plasma, and he named it after what had been recently discovered in biology, plasma in blood. And it's funny, since our official name is Lawrenceville Plasma Physics, we still get phone calls from people saying, oh, can you do analysis of my blood? We say, it's not that kind of plasma. So Langmuir had named it plasma after blood plasma because he thought it acted almost like it was alive. It was so complex, so self-organizing, that he thought that this was a good name for the phenomena. So working from Langmuir and from Birkeland, in the 1930s, Alfvén, who was significantly younger than Chapman, started to develop theories on all scales. So he was working to concretize and more concretely give mathematical descriptions of these force-free filaments in the aurora and in phenomena that were linking the sun to the Earth, the geomagnetic storms, which everybody was concerned about then as now because they can be very destructive of technology. So he was confronted by the fact that Chapman was dominant in this field. And he was held back in in people looking at his work. And he tells the story that he finally went to visit Chapman in England, and he absolutely couldn't engage Chapman in any sort of scientific discussion. Chapman would just shut him down. They would go walking around the campus of, I forget whether it was Oxford or Cambridge, one of these ancient camps. And, Chapman would be basically acting as a tour guide while Alfvén would be saying, but in the case of the currents, don't you see that there's a contradiction between your theory? And he would say, and if you see this ancient building, this was built in 1256. So you
Amazing.
can imagine the comic, and not so comic. And when Chapman returned the favor and visited Alfvén, where they had reconstructed a working model of Birkeland's Torello, Chapman absolutely refused to look at it. He only had to go down a few steps into the basement, and he just wouldn't do it. It was like the priests refusing to look through Galileo's telescope. So that was one big aspect that impeded the acceptance of Alfvén's ideas that were based directly on Birkeland's for further development. In the other direction, he started dealing with the Big Bang because Lemaitre had both suggested the Big Bang, which was known to really a very small number of scientists, and he had said that the key evidence, observational evidence for the Big Bang was cosmic rays. Because people already could measure the energy of cosmic rays, and they knew that the energy of cosmic rays exceeded the energy of nuclear processes. So nuclear processes could produce particles up to 10, 15, 20 MeV, but not beyond. So he said nothing in the universe could have created these cosmic rays, which we see, everywhere in the earth. So they must have come from the Big Bang, because the Big Bang had this which now the Big Bang did not exist as a phrase. He called it the primeval atom. So this primeval atom, in our terms, like a giant neutron star, broke up. And that was the explosion that drove the Big Bang and the expansion of space.
It's astonishing what symmetry this has to the cosmic egg that's the creation myth of countless cultures. Like the egg hatches and from it emerges everything.
Right. Yeah. And Alfvén made that point, that it was very similar to mythology, so it had big resonance. And Lemaitre was aware of that point. I mean, he not only was a priest, he was active in the hierarchy.
Yeah, he famously had to tell the Pope to quiet down because the Pope was so excited about this new physical theory. He was like, that's making us look bad.
Yeah, he's like, you got to stop telling people what an awesome theory this is.
Right.
I found something a long time ago that I haven't been able to find the quote again of Lemaitre talking about his theory, where he expressed a feeling that he felt it was necessary to create something that was parsimonious with what humans liked. And he was like, humans can't handle eternity, and so we can't have that be at the center of our understanding scientifically because it's too vast and uncomfortable and weird, and so we have to have the primeval atom as the device, the deus ex machina.
But I do have a direct quote in the book where he does say that it's a great satisfaction to him personally that he has created this scientific cosmology that is in accord with the cosmology of the Catholic Church.
Did Lemaitre and Alfvén overlap temporally at all? Like, were they alive at the same time?
I would assume so. I don't think they had any interaction.
Okay.
But they did have an interaction scientifically because Alfvén looked at this phenomena of cosmic rays, which people did find difficult to explain, and basically went from the technology that was under development of the particle accelerator, the cyclotron, and other particle accelerators. He knew that people either had, I don't know at what point in the 30s, the possibility of achieving energies by electromagnetic means that were in excess of any that were produced by nuclear reactions. So he basically said, knowing what we know of plasmas, can we find an acceleration mechanism that could exist in the universe? And he actually did not go from the sun, which now we know does produce cosmic rays, but he went up to the galactic scale and he developed a process which is still known as the Alfvén acceleration process, by which in the magnetic field of the galaxy, which already was known to exist, particles could be bounced from one part of the field to the other, gathering energy from the magnetic field, and that the galaxy could work as a gigantic particle accelerator. Or, I don't know what it would have been called in those days, but so there were very many mechanisms. One mechanism, for example, was based on the Faraday disk generator, which I again feature in many of our explanatory works, which you have, if you have a rotating plasma, as in the case of a galaxy rotating in a magnetic field, then you have accelerating fields. And you can calculate these accelerating fields very easily. And you can see that they can accelerate up to energies way beyond what could be measured in the 1930s and what was measured, as high as any we've measured in cosmic rays today. So he published this theory, and that did get a good circulation. And from that time, people basically said, well, Lemaitre didn't, whatever this general relativity stuff is, Lemaitre didn't know what he was talking about. And cosmic rays clearly didn't come from the Big Bang. So that was a first sort of victory of the plasma approach over what I would call the first Big Bang, which was Lemaitre's primeval atom based on cosmic rays as evidence.
So something interesting happens, right? Because Alfvén actually becomes quite famous. He ends up winning the Nobel Prize for his work on magnetohydrodynamics. And Gareth pointed out something interesting to us the other day where he said that an interesting feature of MHD is that it assumes magnetic fields are baked into the fluid flow of the plasma. And by doing that, it, in some sense, ignores how important currents are in shaping those magnetic fields. And so he kind of points to this as a moment where the electrical aspects of the cosmos were, in some sense, able to be ignored because the MHD was so successful without actually bringing current into the discussion. What do you make of that?
But the story is a little, a little more complicated. Excuse me. We'll jump over World War II and get into the 50s and especially into the satellite era. So during the 50s, we have Sputnik in 1957. And I was born in 47, so I was plenty old enough to remember this. And it was extremely exciting. And, to the rulers, it was alarming. If you could put a satellite in space, you could put a rocket into New York City. But to everybody interested in science, people had been building up to this. Everybody had been aiming for getting rockets into space. There had been the International Geophysical Year. So this was extremely exciting. So the story I didn't know at the time, but was developing, was that the first satellites all had electromagnetic probes. So that was some of the first evidence people discovered that clearly the space around the Earth was not empty. There was the Van Allen belts that clearly protected us from a lot of rather energetic particles that were floating around out there. Turned out, obviously, coming from the sun. And by 10 years after Sputnik, by the late 60s, these instruments had developed to the point where they could clearly detect in space exactly what Birkeland had detected on the ground. You could trace, as the satellite moved, you could trace the magnetic fields that outlined these vertical currents that were aligned with the magnetic fields. So that was very exciting. And Alan Dressler basically pointed out, hey, Birkeland long ago and Alfvén today were right. And because this was what you call in situ measurements, it was essentially the same as laboratory measurements, except your laboratory was big as the Earth, it did become very widely accepted. I'm not sure Chapman was still alive, but certainly his theory was very rapidly discarded by everybody studying the aurora and the near-Earth environment. And as Alfvén describes, now, of course, Alfvén's prestige, because he had been identified with Birkeland's theory, Alfvén's prestige enormously rose. Second of all, Alfvén had been studying the sun a great deal. And he developed the MHD, the magnetohydrodynamic approximation, to study these waves in the sun. And it was very effective. But he emphasized that, like any approximation, it was only good in a certain set of circumstances. Now, one of the reasons why people went gaga over MHD is because it vastly simplified Maxwell's equations. Now, the fact that Maxwell's equations fit on a t-shirt, and unlike general relativity, are actually very easy to explain. You can explain it in English language in a few sentences and be mathematically accurate. It doesn't mean that nature made them easy to solve. They aren't easy to solve. Nature doesn't have to solve them for them to exist. We have to solve them to make predictions with them. And the problem is that they're not easy to solve because if you look at the equations, the magnetic field is created by the electric currents. The magnetic field alters the direction of the electric currents. And all of this is not directly derived from the equations because the equations give what's called the divergence of the electric field. And the divergence of the electric field means basically it's related to the way the electric field changes with distance. And that's related to how the magnetic field changes with time. So you both have what are called differential equations, which are not very easy to solve, and these equations dealing with the divergence of the field. And from the divergence, you have to get the actual field. So all of this is very complicated. If you use the approximations in MHD, you get something that a computer can handle very easily. So since obviously by the 1960s and 70s, computers were doing a lot of the modeling of scientific work, that was a big advantage. So what was the limitation of MHD? MHD operated on the assumption that the plasma was collisional. A collisional plasma is the opposite of a magnetized plasma. In a collisional plasma, the magnetic field, while very important, we have MHD, alters the direction of charged particles in a time greater than the time for a single collision. So before a charged particle has the time to do one orbit around a magnetic field direction, it hits another particle. So the magnetic field only alters the direction of particles in the same way a slope alters the direction of molecules in a fluid. So it becomes an action on a collective fluid of fluid model, which is why it's called hydrodynamics, magnetic hydrodynamics, with a very close relationship to regular hydrodynamics. So why doesn't that apply in the rest of the universe? Well, stars are the only place in the universe outside of little planets like our own, not mostly plasma, in which the plasma is collisional. Now, that's very important because stars are the source of energy in the universe. The fusion reactions in stars power everything else. But in most of the universe, the plasma is magnetized. So that means that the electrons move many, many times around the magnetic field line before they occasionally run into another charged particle and have a collision. That means currents can only move along the magnetic field lines. You can only get across the magnetic field lines. And again, we're talking about imaginary maps of very real things, which is magnetic field direction, when you have a collision. And if the collisions are very rare, the difference of the conductivity, the ability of current to move across the magnetic field and along the magnetic field, may be millions or billions of fold. So that completely changes how currents and magnetic fields operate. And of course, Alfvén emphasized it. He also emphasized that since currents are so important, you have to take into account what he called the global situation. All currents are closed loops because it's basically impossible for large amounts of charge to accumulate in a good conductor. And space is a very good conductor. So if you want to understand what happens in this part of the universe, which is part of a huge electric current, you have to understand what's happening in all parts of the universe that are connected by that same current. So he started to say, and this was a few years after he formulated the MHD, people were asking him, well, how does this really fit together with the Birkeland currents? And as happens even with the greatest geniuses, he actually said, well, good point. I don't really know. So he wasn't satisfied with that answer. So he went to work. And by that time, I think he was assisted by Dr. Falthammer. And together they said, well, the answer is these filaments that we've been studying can only exist in a magnetized plasma. And because most of the universe is very undense, most of the universe is magnetized plasma, MHD is an excellent approximation for the stars and the sun, which is a star. So MHD you can confidently apply for these collisional plasmas, which we basically, are pretty rare on Earth, but happen in the sun. And the force-free filaments are the model for the magnetized plasma. So Alfvén says in one of his writings, I understood this, it took me a little time, but now I can explain it to others and they'll get it right away. So he ran into a brick wall because nobody wanted to give up MHD for something that was much more difficult to calculate. Once you start dealing with these filaments, you've got something that's really hard to put into a computer. I mean, we know this because these filaments, and I do want to emphasize it, these filaments are absolutely central to the effort to develop fusion energy. For us at LPP Fusion, where we use a device called the dense plasma focus, we use these filaments to concentrate the energy, to increase the density, and to increase the temperature from room temperature to hundreds of times the temperature in the center of the sun, billions of degrees. For most of our colleagues in fusion, these filaments are a nuisance because they help the plasma to wriggle out from artificial magnetic fields that are trying to confine it. So this is absolutely central. But Alfvén could not get this point across. And he saw people applying MHD to these cosmoplasmas. And remember, we're talking about everything outside the stars. The plasmas around the Earth are magnetized. The plasmas between the sun and the Earth are magnetized. The interstellar plasmas are magnetized. Galactic, all the way up, they are all magnetized. And therefore, MHD gives the wrong answer, wildly wrong answers. So starting in the 60s, everybody was using MHD because it was so easy to calculate. Again, I like to use the well-known joke about the drunk who's lost his wallet. And the guy comes up to him and says, "Oh, where did you lose the wallet?" And the drunk says, "Oh, somewhere over there on 9th Street. And the sober man says, "Well, why are you looking for it here under the lamp post? The light's better." This is the same thing. They were using MHD because it was easier to calculate, not because it gave the right answer. So he was so aggravated about this that in his Nobel Prize address, accepting the Nobel Prize for the development of MHD, he spent about a third of it saying, people don't understand this theory. And I've explained to them that this theory doesn't work. And he said, if you use it where it doesn't apply, you are creating pseudoplasmas, things that don't exist in nature and have no relationship to real plasma.
It's so interesting because the word plasma seems to cover both this hyper dense plasma at the surface of the sun, this almost liquid like plasma, and it also can be applied to these rarefied ionized gases throughout the cosmos. Like there's a confusion of state there almost.
Now, the plasma state is a very useful overall generalization because it's the state in which electrons are, at least some electrons, are free to move without connection to the atoms. So it's the question of the freedom of the currents to move. Now, how the currents move is different in the magnetized plasma than in the collisional plasma. So that's why you use the adjective to distinguish these two states within plasmas.
I'm really
Plasma is a different state of matter, just like solid, liquid, and gas are different states. You can have many types of solids, many types of liquids, and people have a variety of, obviously, the difference between a metal in which electrons again can move freely, but it's different than a plasma in which electrons can move freely, and it's different than an insulator.
It's really funny to hear this because we were just talking to Patrick Van Reyes, who's the plasma guy that is going to be at Beyond the Big Bang this summer. And he's losing his mind because now that he's studied plasma in, liquids and in various other exotic conditions, he started to see it everywhere. And we talked to him for hours, and we finally got down to the foundation of the way that he was thinking about it. And he was almost horrified to find himself saying that. He's like, I think that the better question is to ask what in nature is not a plasma versus what is a plasma, because now that he's looked at it for so long, he's like, I think everything almost is a
Well, it's almost like it's a
plasma.
state of matter. Like you can find this state of matter in different phases as well.
Well, not really. I mean, yes, you can have plasma states in things that are not gases. That's true. But it does have a pretty strict, it isn't that everything is plasma. It does have a pretty strict definition. And in fact, on
I'm
Earth,
starting to think we need to add a what is a plasma panel to the
all right, well,
to
we
the
can do that.
proceedings.
But on Earth, most things are in the neutral state. The neutral state is when basically the neutral state is when almost all electrons are tied to atoms. So the number that can move freely is very small, basically. Now, yeah. So we
But
can
if you,
get into it another place, a more scientific definition, so that it becomes clear why metals are not plasmas. They're not. But
but you can actually model a metal as a degenerate electron gas at the end of the day.
right, but that's not the same thing. But when we talk about neutral substances, the fact is the atmosphere in this room, the wooden desk, myself, all of these things are not plasmas. They are made up of overwhelmingly neutral atoms to the point that free electrons are very, a very small proportion that are free to move in any direction. So, anyway, to get back to the story.
Oh, it's an interesting free to move in any direction is an interesting feature of that, right? Because like as you say, like the because I was like, well, inside of the body you can bound your system to like the electron transport chain of the mitochondria, where there's definitely like the flow of electrons, and they do seem to have some kind of degree of freedom, but they seem well channeled. Like it's more like a wire than it is just this space where they can move any direction that they want to. Like they're very
I mean,
direct.
the point, that, the difference between a current in a plasma and a current in a solid conductor is that in a solid conductor, the electrons are moving, but they're hopping from one atom to the next. So the difference is in a plasma, the electrons are for significant lengths of time disassociated, moving independently of the ion. And of
Yeah, it's
course,
all about lattices, right? Just depends whether
yeah,
there's a lattice where the
so
nuclei are frozen.
yeah, basically, I would say that that's a good layman's definition. Definition is that in a current in a solid, you've got electrons hopping from one atom to another, while in a plasma, they really are traveling by themselves, as it were.
Except for the surface of the sun, right? Because you have this collisional scenario where the nuclei, their location is fixed by their collisions, and so you have something closer to the wire actually going on with
No,
MHD.
but again, in the sun, you do not. You have basically 100% ionization. In the sun, even at its surface, is 10,000 degrees. 10,000 degrees, an electronic measure, is approximately 1 electron volt. So by the time you reach 1 electron volt already, more than half of your hydrogen is ionized. And as you go deeper into the sun, temperature rises very rapidly, as it paradoxically does in the opposite direction as well. And then you get almost 100% ionization. So 100% ionization means that even though the electrons and the ions are always colliding with each other, they don't remain in association. You don't have electrons moving in steady orbits around the nuclei. So that's the quantum-defined state of a neutral atom. And with hydrogen, since it only has 1 electron, there's only 2 states. There's either total ionization or a totally neutral atom. And so basically, in a conductor, for example, in your body, the vast majority of the time, the electrons are tied in that quantum state inside the atoms, inside the molecules. And they're just briefly hopping. A small minority of them are hopping because the sort of currents that are within us, it's an absolutely, a trillionth of a trillionth of the electrons are actually carrying the current. But in the sun, basically the collisions are just collisions. They're collisions between 2 free particles, and the atoms never form. So that's a big difference.
All right. Well, can we turn our attention to the birth of the new mythology at this point?
Well, as I say, all right, so we're getting into the 70s, and after the discovery of the cosmic microwave background, the Big Bang starts to become a dominant theory. Now, again, it's already pretty unscientific because people like Gamow and Dickey and other prominent scientists had predicted that there would be some radiation in the universe as a result of the Big Bang. That was a really vague prediction because people already knew that there was radiation in the galaxy. There had to be. Basically, bodies at any temperature are going to radiate something similar to a black body spectrum. So the question was, if you want to make a prediction, what is that temperature? Because one number does describe any black body radiation, and that number is temperature. So the temperature is directly linked by the black body formula to the amount of radiation. Take the amount of radiation, and it varies as the 4th power of the temperature. So the question is, what is the amount of the radiation? We know it's going to be out there, and therefore, what is the temperature? They're mathematically linked. So what were the predictions? Well, Gamow said 50 K, 50 degrees absolute. Dickey said 5 K. So what was measured? 2.5 K. So if you want to look at Dickey, how close was it? A factor of 2 in the temperature, factor of 16 off in the radiation density. Not too good. I mean, you could throw a dart as easily. Look at Gamow, 50 K. That was the most publicized prediction because it was actually in one of his popular books.
Right before the discovery of the CMB as well, I might add.
Right. And so these were true predictions. So 50 K, 20 times error on temperature, and 16,000 times error on energy density. So were these verified predictions? I mean, come on. But the media took it and ran with it. And, there was a lot of rewriting of history. I mean, you can really compare the published papers with what people said afterwards. And they did backdate some of their predictions pretty badly. So first of all, you have two things happening. The CMB saying it's not the steady state. And, maybe it is the Big Bang. And this is a popular field. Second thing that came in at the same time was the discovery of quasars. Quasars were ultra dense, ultra energetic explosions extending over tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of years. And some of these same people said, oh, this is a fire, this must be black holes. This must be hyper condensed material, because what else could produce this? So this was exactly the same argument that Lemaitre had used about the Big Bang. What else could have produced it? So in this process, Alfvén was shifting his attention from inside the solar system, partially because he had won the argument, and Alfvén was interested in the most controversial parts of the science that he could contribute to. So he started looking at the galactic and supergalactic scales. And during this period, I think we're moving into the 80s, he developed a completely different model of the quasars. From this question, he went back to his research in the 30s, explaining cosmic rays, explaining how gigantic electric currents must be moving through the galaxies to explain their observed magnetic fields, and saying at the center of these galaxies, you could have an enormous concentration of energy electromagnetically, and that could power these enormous beams, just like the enormous energies of the cosmic rays could be powered purely electromagnetically. So from there, he went to address the Big Bang. And first he addressed it methodologically, basically doing the cosmological pendulum description, and the fact that this was mathematical myth. And it's very important to say a mathematical myth is just as mythological as a myth written in English or Hebrew or Aramaic, because mathematics is a language. Part of this mythologizing was a mythologizing of math itself, that math was something supernatural. Really, they're really talking about it as a supernatural force. Mathematics is a language. It's a quote unquote universal language because people all around the world use the same symbols. So is musical notation. People all around the world, I think, use the same musical notation. It's a language that people have developed to describe scientific theories, because two things. One is it's a compact way of describing quantitative concepts. Quantitative concepts can be described in other languages. 1, 2, 3, 4 is quantitative concept in English, but it's very compact. And the second thing, which makes mathematics different from other languages, is that a true statement in mathematics has to be logically consistent with the rest of the mathematical system. So, in English, perfectly good English statement can be, well, he's an idiot, but he's not. So anyone saying that, clearly it's a logical contradiction, but it would have pretty clear meaning to anyone who was a native English, fluent English speaker. But you can't allow that. That is not a valid mathematical statement. If you can prove that some statement is the equivalent to A and not A, then you say QED, this is invalid. And if you can prove that it is consistent, you can say QED, it's proved. It doesn't mean it describes reality. A good English statement is, I was visited by a fairy just now. Perfectly good English sentence, but has no relationship to the truth, to validity. And you can make valid mathematical statements that have no relation to reality, such as the mathematical underpinnings of the Big Bang. The universe is expanding, can be described mathematically, but a universe that isn't expanding can be derived mathematically. But one of these statements is true, and that can't be determined mathematically.
Well, so this brings us back kind of to where we started, right? Go ahead.
Yeah, Ptolemy's system was very accurate as well in terms of predicting what was going to happen. It was a valid mathematical statement of the phenomenon, but it turned out to not be the correct basis for the solar system.
I
And
would
this
not
is-
say that was a correct statement.
Well, it's
Ptolemy's system could be set into correspondence with observations that had already been made. But if you tried to predict the future, it became inaccurate extremely rapidly. And this created practical problems for the astronomers who were actually trying to deal with the most difficult problem, which was predicting the motion of the planets. The planets got out of alignment with the epicycles very rapidly, within months. And for the position of the moon, it was even more rapid. And there were clear, well-known contradictions between dimensions of the moon, the apparent diameter of the moon, and the predictions of the theory. Because if you took literally that the moon was riding these epicycles, the moon would be much closer to the Earth at the perihelion than at the aphelion.
I think that
People knew from ancient times that the change in diameter of the moon was very small.
I think that maybe instead of pointing to like the Ptolemaic system, I know that Tycho Brahe came up with a system that had like a small orbit for the Earth at the center of this. No?
No, that Simon came up with that small orbit thing.
Oh, so for Tycho, it was just at the center. But it was basically like the Earth is at the center, the moon orbits it, and then there's the like two other systems that orbit it. And so it's like it gives you something. I think that Brahe's system was like a little bit more accurate in the sense of predictions. Because I think so this is what's crazy. And I think that this is relevant to the point that we're discussing here, which is that I think that you can, standing on Earth, accurately model a version of the solar system that has the Earth either at its center or very close to its center. I think you can mathematically chart that out. It's not going to be a parsimonious explanation because you're going to have a lot of really weird motions, like you're going to have all these weird trichoidal orbits. But I think that you can make that. And the point that you're making here is that you can have a mathematical model that is accurate, but it isn't true because there's another one.
I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying it can be made to fit. It is a mathematically true statement that any mathematical model can be made to fit an existing set of data with enough what we call free parameters. So if you have the data, you know the data, it's been collected in the past, then you can fit a model, which means that that fitting to past data is not a test of the validity of the model, because you can always do it. The test is to predict data after you have made the prediction. And that's what makes science useful. If it was just explaining what we already knew, it would be just so stories like
So
Kipling.
this is
But
what's
to make it useful, just let me finish, it has to predict the future. That's what's useful to us, to know that the plane will take off and land us in Paris. As I've said to people, including scientists, who say, oh, science is just another mythology. It's just another way of knowing. It's no better than the Bible. And I said this to a scientist who was in an airport with me. And I said, honestly, Alfvén, if you really believed that, I don't think he did, I don't advise you to get on that plane, because it's nothing but mythology that's keeping it in the air. So that's the difference between science and Ptolemaic method. Can you predict the future? So what happened with the Ptolemaic system and its great, aesthetic appeal of these perfect circles? The Ptolemaic system had really three elements. One is the Earth was the center of the universe. Two was heavenly bodies are perfect, so they must move in perfect circles. Three was, can't describe the exact ideological justification, but heavenly bodies have to move at a steady pace. So there's no real change in the heavens. So that became a problem. Tycho Brahe had made very accurate observations without telescopes of the motion of Mars. It became impossible to predict the motion of Mars with the Ptolemaic system. There were always mistakes, no matter how many epicycles you added. Kepler inherited Tycho Brahe's data. And he said, I know how to do this. Throw out these circles. The real ideological thing is the perfect
ellipse.
solids. The perfect solids. So these had been discovered by Greek mathematicians, the icosahedron, the isohedron, and so on.
And this is downstream of like another mathematical cult, right? Because
Right.
this was all like the Pythagorean mysticism
Right,
of
all
shapes that can be
Pythagorean.
arranged.
And Kepler was really a good Pythagorean. So he made these elaborate models. And guess what? He couldn't predict the location of Mars. So that was when he underwent his scientific revolution. He said, mathematics or no mathematics, I really want to predict the Mars. And Mars was the toughest one. In retrospect, we know why Mars was the toughest one, because it was the most elliptical orbit. It was too hard to track Mercury because it had this habit of getting close to the sun in the sky. But of the outer planets, Mars had the most elliptical orbit. So that's why it was giving everybody the most trouble. And Kepler made this brilliant decision. Okay, mathematical beauty out the window. They're moving in ellipses. And he had this tremendous insight. I don't know enough about his detailed history to see how he got to there. But you throw out the mathematical model and you base it on the ellipse as a way to predict the motion of Mars. And then he could predict the future motion of Mars with the simple model that everything was moving in ellipses. So it wasn't even primarily the shift to the Earth-centered. It was obvious that it had to be sun-centered because one of Kepler's laws was that the orbits of the planets were ellipses with one focus being the location of the sun. So, that was a huge step in the direction of junking the Ptolemaic method. So that's exactly the problem we have with cosmology today. Today, the Big Bang Theory makes tons of predictions that are provably in conflict with at least a dozen different data sets. And when this happens, and when this has happened repeatedly since the 1970s, instead of saying the Big Bang Theory is wrong, which is the scientific conclusion, that it's not valid, that the universe isn't expanding, they do the Ptolemaic trick. They say, well, we're going to alter the theory, always making it more complicated, and fit the data we already have, and produce new predictions, which are always going to be wrong. And I have seen people, on the videos say, this is good science. This is the way science goes. We as scientists are excited when we're proven wrong. And no, that's not science. That's the Ptolemaic method. So can I point out some examples of this? Because I'm really
Please,
thinking yeah. So as I say, there are a dozen, more than we really have time for. But let me just pick sort of my favorite. And they're my favorite because they've been strengthened. Contradiction with observations has been strengthened in the past couple of years. So let's look at some basic predictions that the Big Bang makes. The Big Bang says that the universe went through a hot, dense period. Hot, dense matter has to produce fusion reactions. That's the only place fusion reactions really exist in large numbers. You have to have the heat, you have to have the density, the temperature and the density.
except for lattice confined fusion, but that's maybe an edge case.
All right, well,
Deal with some other time.
I said in large amounts. You can't have fusion in large amounts without having temperature and density. So as a result of this, the Big Bang produces a specified amount of helium-4, the second largest amount of matter in the universe is helium-4, normal helium, and lithium. And the isotope of hydrogen, deuterium. So these are firm predictions. And as the theory became more elaborate, became related to the variations in the cosmic microwave background, these predictions became more and more exact. And they're completely wrong. So helium is predicted to be approximately 24%. I mean, they have several more decimal places. And we see in more and more observations of helium both in stars and in interstellar medium, as you get older and older stars, and we can see that they're older because they have less heavier elements in them, which everybody agrees are produced by supernova, the amount of helium gets less and less. So we see a slope downward to at least 11%. And 11% is many, many standard deviations less than their predictions of 24.7%. So that's a complete contradiction that there's no way around. It's a very firm prediction. Lithium. So lithium and, okay, the other side of this, it's a firm prediction of the non-expanding model, which uses, existing physics demonstrated in the laboratory that says this helium must have been produced in the early history of every galaxy by stars like our sun, producing helium by thermonuclear fusion in stars. And it would show that the older the star, the less the helium. And it's quantitatively verified by observations. So that's example number one. Lithium, the same thing. Lithium is supposed to be produced at the level of approximately 4 to 6 times 10 to the 10th. So that's 0.6 to 0.4 parts per billion compared with hydrogen. No, that's not the observations. Observations is that as you again move to older and older stars with less and less of the heavy elements, there's a plateau that's a quarter the level of the predicted plateau. And then you get to the purest, the oldest stars, there's a slope straight down to zero. So to unobservable levels of lithium. Again, without an expanding universe, you can predict on the basis of plasma theory, known cosmic ray cross sections, that the lithium can be produced entirely by cosmic rays produced by stars in galaxies like our own. So that's number two.
I think you might have misspoken about something. I was trying to follow this, but you said that the older stars should be expected to have less of the helium, but wouldn't they accumulate more of it as they were fusing hydrogen?
No, because this is this is part of the correct predictions when I and others looked at what would happen in the evolution of a galaxy, guided by what we knew of plasma physics and gravitation and nuclear fusion. So basically, what the prediction was that the size of stars that are produced at a given epoch in the galaxy's evolution was inversely correlated with the density of plasma that they came at. So you have bigger stars forming first. Bigger stars, everybody agrees, burn their fuel much faster. It goes approximately as the cube, inverse cube of the mass.
I see. So when you're talking about the age of stars, you're talking about whether it's a first or second or third generation star. You're talking about in the age of the galaxy.
I'm saying older stars are the ones that are produced earlier in the history of the galaxy and survive to they have to survive to today for us to observe them. But in the history of a galaxy, the first stars are the ones that are today the oldest. Well, those first stars were the stars that are even older than the ones that we see surviving, which did not survive. Those were bigger and produced helium more rapidly. So that helium was incorporated into the later stars,
Got it.
which also did not survive until you get to approximately the third or fourth generation, in which the stars are small enough to have long enough lives. So the helium that we observe in their outer atmospheres is the helium that they acquired that was produced in earlier generations of stars. The helium that is in their core is, that's a separate, that we can measure separately, indirectly by how they vibrate. So we're talking about stars that in the outside, in their outer atmospheres, have much less than 24% helium. And the older the stars are, the earlier they were produced in this epoch when the stars were old and small enough to survive to the present day, then we see the helium go down. And all of these observations have been verified long after the predictions were made. Even before JWST, we saw that the younger galaxies had, on average, much bigger stars, and their ratio of luminosity to mass was hundreds of times larger. So that means absolutely they were producing helium hundreds of times faster than the Milky Way is today. That's a universal observation of galaxies. So, helium is wrong, lithium is wrong. Deuterium, at the moment, they've got it right, but even some observations are saying maybe that's a little off. But deuterium is the only one they've got right. So, number 3, me and my colleagues, Ricardo Scarpa and Renato Falomo, have concentrated for years on this Coleman test. You have an expanding universe. You have a strange optical illusion that objects at a far distance should look larger on the sky than nearer ones. This operates basically beyond a redshift of approximately 1. In a non-expanding universe, just like on Earth, obviously more distant objects get smaller in proportion to their distance, their diameter on the sky. We've done studies with HST, with JWST. We're about to publish a new one. There's an absolute 100% correspondence between the predictions of the non-expanding universe and observations of the images of galaxies. Absolute contradiction with the predictions of the Big Bang. And even though the Big Bangers who knew of these contradictions said, well, the galaxies were really small back then, so it compensates for the fact that they're not as large as we predict. Subsequent observations have shown that's physically impossible. There are independent measurements of the mass of galaxies that can be made 2 ways. Based on their luminosity, you can measure the amount of gas. And based on their velocity of rotation, which can be measured from their spectrum, you can use Newton's equations to measure their mass given their true linear radius. So the true linear radius in the Big Bang hypothesis is much smaller. You have these supermassive galaxies as massive as our own, that are squeezed into 100 times smaller radius, 1,000,000 times smaller volume. But these observations completely cut through that because they show that the mass of gas is 10 or 20 or even 100 times bigger than the total mass of the galaxies if you use the Big Bang formula. And this contradiction completely disappears if you use the non-expanding formula. So you get what people call impossible galaxies. And another paper showed that these galaxies would be so dense, 100 million stars per cubic parsec. So that's 4 million stars per cubic light year, that the stars would undergo chain reaction collisions, that the collisions between 2 stars would create a cloud of plasma or gas that other stars would bump into and be destroyed, and the whole thing would blow up within, 100,000 years or something. So it's impossible that the expanding universe predictions are right. They completely contradict by observation. So that's a third basic contradiction. The fourth one of my favorites, and as I say, this is not a complete list, is the large-scale structures. The Big Bang, because the Big Bang happened, 13.8 or 14 billion years ago, there is a limit on the size of structures that could have been created in that time. And that limit can be checked observationally because we can see how fast matter is moving in the universe and how big objects are. And if you put those two together, even accounting for the expansion of the universe, you can get an ultimate size for objects. And that ultimate size, this is a prediction that hasn't changed essentially since the beginning of the Big Bang, is about 300 megaparsecs, or about 1 billion light years. So because things don't travel anywhere close to the speed of light, in 14 billion light years, you can only create objects 1 billion light years across. And now many astronomers looking at many different measurements, galaxies, phenomena called gamma ray bursts that we can see at great distances, quasars that we can see at great distances. All of these phenomena and many more outline structures that are much larger than this limit. Structures that are up to 4.5 billion parsecs. So that's about more than 10 billion, 12 billion light years in radius. So that completely contradicts by an order of magnitude the lifetime of the Big Bang universe. So these objects would have had to take not 14, but more than 140 or 150 billion years to form. And in fact, with reasonable hypotheses, they probably are 1 trillion or more years old. So these are things that there's just no way to get around. And of course, in a universe where gravity and plasma and electromagnetism are interacting in a universe that has no beginning, we have exactly predicted the hierarchy of structure up to these larger structures observed. And these weren't recent predictions. I have papers published back to the late 1980s that made these predictions that are completely confirmed.
What do the Big Bangers try to do to rescue the observation of these large-scale structures?
They basically say they're flukes.
Mm.
That's a hell of a fluke.
They basically say, it's like the man in the moon. People are used to seeing patterns. So
we're imagining them.
These big rings. I mean, if you've looked at the big ring or the big arc, these are, arcs of circles, or a complete circle in the case of the big ring. The big ring is actually a nice little helix, just like we predicted. So they're basically saying, oh, you're doing the statistics wrong. These are just random fluctuations. So I should point out that this is also the reaction with the lithium. The latest reinforcement of the lithium, the Big Bangers were saying, well, somehow, we're not sure how, the stars were destroying the lithium, destroying them in just such a way to disguise that the lithium was much higher. But a recent discovery last year of lithium in the interstellar medium of our neighboring satellite galaxy, the Large Magellanic Cloud, showed that even in the interstellar gas, which should have exactly the Big Bang lithium, the lithium level is a factor of 4 beneath it. And what has been the reaction? Basically, that paper's been ignored. Now, I did see, I think it was yesterday, one paper describing this lithium problem, saying, oh, yeah, there was this observation last year. And they just basically said, well, yeah, there was that. But the other reaction they have to all of these things is they take them out of context and say, well, yeah, there's the helium problem. Oh, yeah, the lithium problem. We know about that. Oh, yeah, there's the large scale structure problem. Yeah, we know about that. Oh, yeah, there's the size problem. We know about that. But in each case, they take the problem separately and say, well, they're an anomaly. Overall, this is a very well confirmed theory. But if you put them all together, it's all whole. They actually have one valid prediction and at least a dozen, maybe you can, depending on how you count them, 16 or more contradictions. But if you try and put them together, I did this experiment. I did an overall, comparison of the two theories, expansion versus non-expansion, quite recently after the launch of the GWST. And I tried to get it published in monthly notices of the Royal Astronomical Society, which had published one of my papers dealing with the specific problem of the Tolman test. And after a little back and forth, an anonymous senior editor, not even an anonymous reviewer, said, if you want to publish an overall description of an overall comparison of expansion versus non-expansion, you certainly should, but it won't be in our magazine. Period.
Wow.
So since this was an anonymous senior editor, I wrote an editor to the editor-in-chief of Menras, who isn't anonymous, and said, are you going to endorse this? I mean, this is totally against the idea that the scientific method publishes, neutrally. If it's valid, you publish it. And he said, yeah, I endorse it. So I had that in writing from an email. And I ended up putting it up on an archive called ResearchGate.
Mm.
So it is available to the public. And I will reference it in my next peer-reviewed paper. We'll see whether they'll say, well, we'll publish your paper, but not with that reference in it. We'll see.
Unbelievable. I mean, I think that this is why I'm so excited about what we're doing in Sesimbra at Beyond the Big Bang, because, we talked a little bit about the way that Gamow popularized science, Hubble popularized science, the way that people attended scientific lectures and participated in the foment of ideas at the turn of the century and how that went away. And I think that they were onto something. I think that you have to get ideas in front of people. You have to bring the scientists together in front of an audience and have the audience be able to encounter the ideas in real time, ask their questions, seek understanding, and then they're going to go out into the world and they're going to see it differently. And it doesn't really matter if the institutions are just ruled by the anonymous editor or reviewer who's like, well, no, I won't publish this, because the wave comes. Like, you can build a seawall, you can try to engineer, but the wave will come. There's nothing that can change the arc of history. No journal can stop the pendulum from swinging. And so I can't say how grateful I am to you for agreeing to come to the conference to speak, because I feel like a conference about what happens beyond the Big Bang could not run without Eric Lerner, because I feel like you've been so central to this whole story for so long. And I'm so excited. We've never had a chance to talk to you at such length before. Like, we met you in New York very briefly. And so this has been a real treat.
Yeah, well, thanks a lot. You got great questions. And, although, because my book, The Big Bang Never Happened, has been published for a long time, I have been sort of the face of the movement. But your conference is also good to emphasize another thing, which is, although our movement is small, I'm not it. There are a growing group of scientists, such as my colleague Martin Lopez Corredora, who are moving in the same direction. I think it's going to be great fun for Martin and I to discuss at great length, to what extent this theory is dead, dying, or or zombified. And I do think that this situation is shifting since JWST and since these other big data sets from ALMA, DESI, because you are seeing that instead of defending the Big Bang as a concordance theory, the lambda CDM is the concordance version of the Big Bang with dark matter and dark energy. Now you're seeing people scatter. They're starting to say, well, LCDM doesn't work, so my theory is emerging dark energy, evolving dark energy. Now, my theory, and this is one of my favorites, is not dark matter, but cannibal dark matter. Don't ask.
It's going to get just
But
progressively more exotic.
You've got this orthodoxy melting into it's every cosmologist for himself or herself. We've all got our theories. Well, becomes much more difficult to defend a theory when it's splintering. And then you say, well, instead of cannibal dark energy plus, emerging dark energy and dark matter, why don't you jump the whole theory? Because if you say the universe isn't expanding, there never was a Big Bang, you only have one free variable and one phenomenon you still need to explain, which is the Hubble relationship itself. I do think you need, new phenomena that we don't know about in our lab to explain the Hubble relation. Hubble thought the same thing. But everything else, the structure of the universe that we see, the amount of light elements, the cosmic microwave background, that can all be explained with the science that we can test, and we have tested many significant figures here in laboratories on Earth and with our probes in the solar system. So I agree with you. I think change is coming, and I think it'll be pretty soon.
Yeah, it's going to be a wild ride. I mean, obviously, understanding Hubble's redshift situation is going to require really understanding light better, probably, I imagine,
Right.
as we move into the future. But that's going to require a whole different team of people to come into the fold, I think. So I don't know. There's a lot that's going to be going down. I'm really, really excited to hang out with you in person again. It's been a long time, and we're going to have an excellent time in Portugal. And if anybody's thinking about coming on vacation to Portugal, this is going to be a historic event, and you should really check it out.
Definitely. We've sold a room block at the hotel completely, and so anybody who's coming, tickets are still down below. We always link them up in the corner.
You're gonna have to get your own room, though.
But you do have to get your own room at this point, so it's gonna be a blast.
Well, I'll ask you how many people filled up the hotel.
So we've got 34 rooms at the hotel, and then we've got another 10 tickets already sold for people that are staying elsewhere. And then I think we're
That's
still going to
great.
sell a bunch more.
Yeah, so we'll be discussing all the whole picture of what's wrong with the Big Bang. And I want to emphasize that you don't have to understand everything about the universe to say that the Big Bang theory is invalidated. You can have an invalidated theory for a phenomena and not have a good theory of it. And that doesn't mean, oh, there's no alternative. Science doesn't work that way. If your plane crashes, it crashes. And you have to wait for the Wright brothers to get on another one. So, we'll be explaining all of this and a new piece of evidence that we haven't even discussed in our videos. So, yeah.
Very tantalizing. All right.
I'm really, really excited, Eric. Yeah.
No, it'll be fun in Portugal.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll see everybody in Portugal. Thank you, guys.
Right.
Thanks for listening.
Have a great
Bye,
rest of your
everybody.
day. Bye.